The glass eye of God. Imagine a telescope made of 10,000 cracked iPad screens, each one reflecting a different human soul being scrubbed clean of its identity. This isn't a sci-fi nightmare. It is the inevitable return of a cosmic architect who views our civilization as a messy, unfinished circuit board. If you find yourself reaching for a screwdriver tonight without knowing why, the broadcast has already reached your mind. For 3 years, 7 months, and 9 days, the world had hummed. It was a sound beneath all other sounds, a subsonic thrum that resonated in the fillings of teeth and the marrow of bones. Scientists offered theories of tectonic friction, of solar winds, of a mass auditory illusion. But no explanation ever felt complete. It was the background radiation of modern life, a constant vibration in the window panes and the fluid of the inner ear. People grew accustomed to it, the world's own heartbeat, until the moment it was stolen away. Elias dropped his porcelain cup, but the sound of it shattering against the tile floor felt thin and artificial, a mockery of true noise. The ringing in his ears was deafening, a high-pitched scream of nerves trying to compensate for the missing frequency. He clutched the edge of the kitchen counter, his knuckles turning white as he waited for the hum to return, for the world to resume its familiar, heavy heartbeat. Every ticking clock in the apartment seemed to have skipped a beat, their mechanical pulses suddenly out of sync with the stillness. He moved to the window, his breath fogging the glass as he looked down at the street 12 stories below. The traffic had halted, as if a giant hand had pressed a cosmic pause button. Drivers stood outside their vehicles, their faces turned upward toward a sky that looked suddenly pale and empty. There was no shouting, no honking of horns, only a sea of people standing in a stillness so profound it seemed as if they were carved from gray stone. The city, usually a riot of mechanical discord, had become a graveyard of stalled ambitions. A woman in a red coat stood by a park bench, her hands frozen on the handle of a blue baby carriage. She didn't look afraid. She looked focused, as if she were listening to a faint melody played on a distant instrument. Slowly, with a grace that felt entirely alien, she reached down and lifted her sleeping infant. She placed the child on the wooden slats of the bench with a gentleness that bordered on the ritualistic, her eyes never once blinking. There was a terrifying, deliberate nature to her movements, a sudden lack of any maternal hesitation. Instead of tending to the child, the woman turned her attention back to the carriage. Her fingers, which moments ago had been trembling, were now steady and precise. She gripped the metal frame and began to pull. There was a sickening screech of metal on metal as she forced a wheel from its axle. She didn't use tools. She used a slow, grinding strength that seemed to ignore the physics of human muscle. She looked like a machine performing a necessary maintenance, stripping away the utility of the object with a cold, mechanical hunger. Across the narrow alleyway, in the apartment directly opposite his own, Elias saw his neighbor, a man named Thomas who had spent 20 years repairing watches. Thomas sat at his workbench, but he wasn't looking at a timepiece. He had dismantled his radio, laying out the transistors and copper coils in a perfect geometric pattern across the wood. His lips were moving in a rapid, silent cadence, a frantic prayer whispered to an audience that Elias could not see. The meticulous arrangement of the electronic guts looked like an altar to a new and hollow god. The sun began to dip behind the skyscrapers, casting long, jagged shadows that looked like ink spilled across a map. The silence was no longer empty. It was heavy with a new kind of presence. It felt as though the atmosphere had thickened, turning into something more like water than air. Every movement in the street below was synchronized, 1,000 individual acts of deconstruction happening in a terrifyingly quiet unison. It suggested the existence of a single, guiding mind, pulling at the strings of a population that had forgotten how to resist. Elias backed away from the window, his heart hammering against his ribs like a bird trapped in a cage. He realized then that the hum hadn't just stopped. It had been a barrier that had finally collapsed. The quiet was a gateway, and the people below were no longer individuals with names and histories. They were vessels being filled by a cold, dark tide. He felt a sudden, irrational urge to check his own phone, to see if the screen still held the light of the world he knew, or if it had also been drafted into this new, silent war. He picked up the device, but the glass felt cold, almost liquid against his palm. The screen was black, yet it seemed to pulse with a faint internal rhythm that matched the drumming of his own blood. He saw his reflection in the dark surface, his eyes wide and panicked. But for a fraction of a second, his image didn't mimic his fear. His reflection remained still, staring back at him with a placid, terrifying neutrality that suggested he was already becoming a stranger to himself. The phone felt like a seed, waiting for his hands to plant it in the dark. Elias set the phone on the wooden table, pulling his hand away as if the plastic had burned him. The silence of the apartment felt like a living thing now, a predator crouching in the corners of the ceiling. He could hear the frantic ticking of his own heart, a wet, rhythmic thumping that seemed far too loud in the absence of the world's vibration. Every creak of the floorboards under his feet felt like a gunshot, echoing through the empty rooms with a hollow, mocking persistence. He returned to the window, drawn by a morbid fascination he could not suppress. The streetlights remained dark, but the city was far from still. Thousands of figures moved in the gloom, their forms illuminated only by the pale, sickly glow of the moon. They didn't need light to see. Their hands moved with a terrifying, intuitive certainty. They were stripping the city bare, removing every piece of glass, every foot of copper wiring, and every circuit board from the machines that had once defined their lives. A block away, a group of men were systematically dismantling an ambulance. They didn't speak, nor did they signal to one another, yet their movements were perfectly synchronized. They pulled the doors from their hinges and stacked them neatly on the asphalt like playing cards. One man reached into the engine bay, his fingers disappearing into the dark grease. He pulled out the battery with a slow, agonizing pull, his face remaining as smooth and expressionless as a mask of poured wax. Elias looked across the hallway through his own peephole, his breath hitching in his throat. The young musician from apartment 412, a man who had once spent hours practicing the cello, was now kneeling on the threadbare carpet. He wasn't playing music. Instead, he was methodically snapping his own fingers, one by one. There was a dull, wet crack for each joint, but the musician didn't flinch. He simply stared at his hands with a vacant, scholarly interest, preparing them for a task that required no finesse. The musician then began to claw at the wallpaper, his broken fingers working with a grotesque, insect-like efficiency. He wasn't searching for food or treasure. He was looking for the wires. When he found a socket, he gripped the plastic casing with his teeth and tore it from the wall, his jaw unhinging with a sickening pop. He pulled the copper strands out like veins, coiling them around his neck as if they were a prize. His eyes, caught in the dim light of the hallway, were nothing but dark, lightless pit. Elias scrambled back from the door, his stomach churning with a cold, acidic bile. He began to drag his heavy oak bookshelf across the floor, the wood groaning against the tile. He needed a barrier, something to separate his reality from the madness that was manifesting just inches away. He piled chairs and boxes against the entrance, his breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. He was building his own fortress of junk, a desperate attempt to stay whole while the rest of the world was being picked apart. As the hours crawled toward midnight, a new sound began to permeate the walls. It wasn't the hum, but a low, rhythmic whispering. It was a sea of voices, thousands of them, murmuring in a language that felt like the rustle of dry leaves or the clicking of teeth. The sound didn't come from any one direction. It seemed to rise from the very foundations of the building. The words were unintelligible, yet they carried a weight of immense antiquity, a series of commands that bypassed the ears and sank directly into the brain. He retreated to his bedroom, the only place that still felt like a sanctuary. He crawled under the blankets, pulling them over his head to drown out the whispering. But the sound was inside him now. It was a vibration in his skull, a gentle, insistent nudging at the back of his mind. It told him that the world was cluttered, that the machines were a sickness, and that the only way to be clean was to take them all apart. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to visualize a wall of pure white noise. The thirst for destruction was not born of anger, he realized, but of a terrifying sense of order. The whisperers weren't rioting. They were cleaning. They were like white blood cells attacking a foreign body, and the technology of the 21st century was the infection. He thought of the billions of microchips, the miles of fiber-optic cables, and the endless satellites orbiting the Earth. To the force behind the silence, these things were nothing more than debris that needed to be collected and repurposed. By 3 a.m, the whispering reached a crescendo, a buzzing hive mind chant that vibrated through the mattress. Elias felt a twitch in his right hand, a sudden, involuntary longing to reach out and touch the digital alarm clock on his nightstand. He stared at the red glowing numbers, 23 minutes past 3, and felt an urge to see the gears inside, to feel the cold electricity against his skin. He sat on the edge of the bed, his fingers dancing nervously against his thighs. He forced himself to look away, focusing instead on a framed photograph of his parents. They looked so small and fragile in their silver frame, relics of a world that had possessed the luxury of noise. He wondered if they were still out there, or if they had already joined the silent workers in the streets. The thought of his mother's hands, once soft and smelling of lavender, now bloodied and raw from tearing apart a kitchen appliance, made him want to scream. But he knew that sound was forbidden now. A heavy thud against his front door made him jump. It was followed by a scraping sound, like metal being dragged across stone. Someone was in the hallway, and they weren't trying to get in. They were harvesting his door. He heard the hinges groan as they were slowly unscrewed, the wood splintering under a steady, relentless pressure. The whisperers were coming for the metal, for the screws, and for the very things that kept him hidden. He was a stone in a river, and the water was beginning to erode his edges. He stood up and grabbed a heavy iron fireplace poker, the only primitive tool he had left. It felt solid and real in his hand, a piece of forged history that didn't rely on a battery or a signal. He stood in the center of his darkened living room, listening to the deconstruction of his life. The television was next, its plastic casing being pried open by invisible hands through the thin walls. He could almost feel the vacuum tubes shattering, the glass dust coating the lungs of the things outside. The realization struck him then, cold and final. The hum had been a shield, a persistent protective layer of static that had kept these ancient commands from reaching the human mind. It had been a gift from a forgotten age, a guardian frequency that had allowed humanity to grow in its own messy, noisy way. But the shield had failed, or perhaps it had simply run out of power after thousands of years of constant use. Now, the signal from the stars was clear, and it was demanding a total reckoning. He looked at his own hands in the moonlight, seeing them not as his own, but as tools. They were capable of such precise movements, such delicate work. He imagined them reaching into the guts of a computer, weaving the wires into something new, something that would help the signal grow stronger. The thought was repulsive, yet it carried a strange, seductive beauty. It was the promise of an end to fear, an end to isolation. All he had to do was stop resisting and join the great work being done in the dark. Outside, the first light of dawn began to gray the horizon. But there was no comfort in the coming day. The city skyline was jagged and broken, the silhouettes of buildings altered by the removal of their antennae and signs. The plaza below was hidden by a thick, rolling fog, but he could hear the rhythmic clatter of metal being piled high. It sounded like a construction site for a monument to a forgotten civilization. The Whisperers were no longer just people. They were the architects of a new, silent world. He felt a strange vibration in his feet, a low-frequency pulse that seemed to be coming from the ground itself. It wasn't the old hum, but something sharper, more purposeful. It was the sound of the spire being tested, a call to the others to bring their offerings. He knew that soon, the walls of his apartment would no longer be enough. The Whisperers would find every scrap of metal he owned, and then they would come for the minerals in his very blood. He gripped the poker tighter, waiting for the first shadow to cross his threshold. The barricade groaned as a heavy weight leaned against it. He could hear the sound of his books being tossed aside, their pages fluttering like the wings of dying birds. The Whisperers were patient, their movements devoid of any hurry or frustration. They had all the time in the universe, and the city was full of resources. Elias watched as a single pale hand reached through a gap in the furniture, its fingers elongated and stained with dark oil. It didn't reach for him. It reached for the brass lamp on the floor. He struck the hand with the iron poker, a dull thud echoing in the room. The figure didn't scream or retreat. It simply withdrew the hand, leaving behind a smear of dark, viscous fluid on the carpet. A moment later, the hand returned, accompanied by another, their movements as rhythmic and mechanical as a clock. They began to pull at the heavy bookshelf, their strength far exceeding anything humanly possible. Elias realized then that he wasn't fighting people. He was fighting a force that had hijacked the biological shells of his neighbors. He backed away toward the balcony, the cool morning air hitting his face. The city was a graveyard of chrome and glass, a testament to a world that had been dismantled in a single night. He looked down and saw the blue baby carriage from the day before, now nothing but a pile of twisted wires and a single, lonely wheel. The woman in the red coat was gone, replaced by a sea of gray figures moving toward the center of the city. They were all carrying parts, pieces of a puzzle that would soon be completed. The sun finally broke over the horizon, but its light revealed only the devastation. The buildings looked like picked-over carcasses, their windows missing and their skeletons exposed to the elements. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and old dust, the scent of a century of progress being undone in a matter of hours. Elias stood on the edge of the balcony, the iron poker feeling heavy and useless in his hand. He was the last witness to a history that was being rewritten in the language of silence. He looked at the clock on his wall one last time. The hands had stopped moving at 3:24. frozen in a moment of eternal stillness. He realized that time itself was being dismantled, or at least our perception of it. The past and the future were being ground into a fine powder, leaving only the infinite, whispering present. He let the poker fall from his hand, watching it spin through the air before it hit the pavement below with a distant, hollow clang. The sound felt like the final word in a very long book. As the first shadow crossed his living room floor, Elias didn't run. He felt a sudden, profound exhaustion, a desire to stop fighting the inevitable tide. The whispering in his head was louder now, a beautiful, complex harmony that promised a peace he had never known. He looked at the shadows and saw not monsters, but laborers in a grand celestial workshop. He reached out his hand, offering the brass lamp to the pale figure that stepped through the ruins of his door, and felt the first touch of the silence begin to claim him. Elias stood at the threshold of his ruined apartment, his feet crunching on the glass of the shattered brass lamp. The hallway outside was a tunnel of peeling shadows, the wallpaper hanging like the skin of a molting reptile. There was no sound of sirens, no distant hum of traffic, only the dry, rhythmic rasp of thousands of breaths moving in a terrifyingly perfect unison. The air tasted of ancient dust and the sharp metallic tang of exposed circuitry. He passed the musician's door, which stood wide open like a screaming mouth. Inside, the man was gone, but his work remained. The cello had been stripped of its strings, the wood splintered into thin, uniform needles that were arranged in a starburst pattern across the ceiling. Every electrical outlet had been excavated with surgical precision, the wires pulled through the walls like a nervous system being harvested from a corpse. It was a masterpiece of pointless industry. The stairwell was a descent into a mechanical underworld. He encountered others on the landings, people he had nodded to for 5 years, whose names he had never bothered to learn. They brushed past him with a heavy, purposeful gait, their arms laden with the guts of televisions and the cooling fans of computers. Their eyes were fixed on a point far beyond the concrete walls, their pupils dilated until the irises were nothing more than thin, colored rings around an empty, black void. Emerging into the daylight felt like stepping onto a different planet. The city he knew had been replaced by a skeletal imitation. Cars had been rolled onto their sides, their undercarriages exposed and picked clean of every bolt and hose. A group of 3 teenagers was methodically dismantling a traffic light, their fingers bleeding from the jagged metal, yet they showed no sign of pain. They worked with a rhythmic, percussive efficiency, tapping out a code on the hollow poles. The flow of people was a silent river, all of them moving toward the center of the metropolitan district. Elias found himself swept up in the current, his own legs moving with a strange, borrowed energy. No one bumped into anyone else. The crowd moved with the fluid grace of a school of fish, a collective intelligence navigating the ruins. He saw a man carrying a bundle of fiber optic cables that trailed behind him like glowing, translucent intestines, sparking faintly in the dirt. Every storefront had been breached, not for food or luxury goods, but for the silicon and the gold hidden within the electronics. The jewelry stores remained untouched, their diamonds gleaming uselessly in the windows, while the mobile phone kiosks had been gutted to the bare studs. This was a theft of function, not of value. The whisperers were gathering the sensory organs of the old world, preparing to knit them into something that could perceive a reality far beyond human sight. He reached the great plaza at noon on the 4th day of the silence. The space was dominated by a mound of debris that rose 50 feet into the air, a chaotic mountain of plastic and steel. Thousands of people were swarming over it like ants on a carcass, weaving wires together and fusing metal with a heat that seemed to radiate from their very palms. There were no blueprints, no foremen, only the shared, silent understanding of the geometry required by the coming signal. At the center of the mound, the spire was beginning to take shape. It was a jagged, crooked needle of a building, constructed from the vertical beams of dismantled cranes and the elevator tracks of skyscrapers. It didn't follow the laws of human architecture. It leaned at an impossible angle, its silhouette shivering against the clouds. It looked less like a tower and more like a claw, reaching out to snag something passing by in the high, cold reaches of the atmosphere. The Whisperers worked with a frantic, trembling speed, their movements blurred by the intensity of their labor. He saw a woman he recognized from the bakery, her apron stained with grease instead of flour, as she soldered two circuit boards together using a piece of heated wire. Her lips moved in that same rapid, silent cadence he had seen in his neighbor. It was a prayer of assembly, a linguistic glue that seemed to hold the impossible structure together against the wind. The sound of the work was a rhythmic clicking, the clatter of a billion mechanical parts being snapped into place. It was a percussive symphony that vibrated through the soles of Elias's boots, a new heartbeat for a world that had lost its old one. He felt the urge to contribute, to find a piece of the puzzle and slot it into the growing lattice. His pockets were heavy with the screws and batteries he had instinctively gathered from his own kitchen before leaving his home. He looked up and saw that the spire was already 3 times the height of the surrounding buildings. Its surface was a mosaic of broken screens, thousands of them, their dark faces reflecting the gray sky. He imagined them all turning on at once, a wall of static that would drown out the sun. The structure hummed with a dormant power, a tension that made the hair on his arm stand up. It was a lightning rod for an ancient storm that was finally rolling in from the deep void. By late afternoon, the first layer of the spire's skin was complete. It was a shimmering, oily coat of copper mesh and shredded lead, designed to catch a frequency that human ears had never been meant to process. The air around the plaza began to shimmer with a distorted heat, though the temperature remained biting and cold. The laws of light were beginning to bend, the shadows of the workers stretching and twisting into shapes that did not correspond to their physical bodies. Elias stood at the base of the construction, feeling the immense gravity of the object. It wasn't just made of metal. It was made of the redirected intent of 10 million souls. The sheer volume of the whispering was now a physical pressure, a constant mumble that vibrated in his teeth. He realized the tower was a mouth, a giant artificial throat waiting to scream back at the stars. It was a monument to the end of individual thought, a cathedral built from the bones of the digital age. He saw a child, no older than 6, carrying a motherboard as if it were a sacred relic. The boy climbed the jagged side of the tower with a terrifying lack of fear, his small hands finding purchase in the gaps between twisted girders. He slotted the board into a waiting gap near the top and descended with the same vacant, serene expression as the adults. There was no hierarchy here, only the absolute equality of the possessed, each a vital cell in a blossoming planetary organism. The sun dipped below the horizon on the evening of the 5th day, but the work did not slow. The Whisperers didn't need sleep, nor did they seem to require water or food. Their bodies were being sustained by the very frequency they were laboring to receive. Elias felt his own hunger fading, replaced by a cold, buzzing energy that made his limbs feel light and hollow. He was becoming part of the circuit, a biological capacitor being charged for the final, catastrophic discharge. He looked toward the north and saw similar flickers of activity on the horizon. Other cities were building their own needles, thousands of them across the globe, all aiming for the same empty patch of space. The world was turning into a pincushion, a bristling sphere of antennae designed to invite an intruder into the parlor. The silence was the breath taken before the plunge, the momentary stillness of the forest before the predator strikes the panicked, unseeing prey. A man standing next to Elias reached out and touched his shoulder. The contact was devoid of warmth, the skin feeling like dry parchment. The man pointed upward with a trembling finger, toward a star that seemed to be pulsing with a rhythmic green light. It wasn't a star Elias recognized. It was a wandering eye, an ancient traveler that had been waiting for the signal shield to fail. The man's lips moved faster now, the whispering becoming a frantic, joyful hiss of welcome. The first sparks began to dance along the copper mesh of the spire, tiny arcs of blue electricity that jumped between the salvaged wires. They didn't smell of burning. They smelled of ozone and wet earth. The structure was waking up, a giant, mindless beast stirring in its nest of junk. Elias felt the screws in his pocket vibrate against his hip, a sympathetic resonance with the tower's growing appetite. The time for observation was over. The time for integration had arrived. He stepped forward, his hand reaching for a protruding piece of rebar at the base of the mountain. As his fingers closed around the cold metal, a surge of information flooded his mind, a torrent of numbers and coordinates that made his eyes roll back in his head. He saw the world not as a home, but as a harvest. He understood the beauty of the deconstruction, the necessity of the stripping away. He began to climb, his hands moving with a purpose that was no longer his own. Elias hauled himself higher along the skeletal framework of the spire, his muscles ignoring the agonizing strain of the climb. The cold metal bit into his palms, leaving streaks of dark, oily residue on the rusted iron. But he felt no pain. His mind was filled with a complex, glowing diagram of interconnected nodes and binary pathways. He was no longer a man. He was a bridge between 2 points of copper. Each movement was governed by a logic he could not name but understood perfectly. From 40 stories up, the city below looked like a flayed animal, its concrete skin peeled back to reveal the pulsing veins of the streets. The silence at this height was thinner and more fragile than the heavy quiet of the alleyways. He could see the horizon, where 3 other spires were rising like black needles through the clouds. The world was being sewn back together by an unseen hand, using the threads of human desperation and the jagged remains of the old world. The tower vibrated with a dormant, hungry energy that traveled through his boots and into the marrow of his bones. Every time a new piece of hardware was added, the frequency of the vibration shifted. It was not a sound, but a shivering in the air that made the light appear to fracture into thousands of oily rainbows. The structure was alive, a mimicry of biological life built from recycled ghosts and the entrails of the digital age. It was a heart made of steel, waiting for its first beat. He saw a woman 3 levels below him, her movements fluid and devoid of hesitation. Her skin had begun to take on a strange metallic sheen, and her hair had been replaced by fine silver filaments that swayed in the absence of wind. She was weaving her own nerves into the bundle of wires she carried, her eyes rolling back in her head as her consciousness was slowly overwritten by the cold architecture of the machine. She was no longer a daughter or a mother. She was a conduit. The whispering was no longer a mumble. It was a rhythmic, oceanic tide of information that crashed against the shores of his sanity. It spoke of the great harvest, of the final cleansing of the atmosphere, and of the arrival of the master. The words felt like sandpaper against the inside of his skull. He knew that the individual called Elias was a dying ember, and soon there would only be the white fire of the hive. The memories of his old life were being deleted to make room for the signal. Above the heavy clouds, the satellites were being silenced one by one. The stars that humanity had placed in the heavens to guide their movements were being plucked out by invisible cosmic hands. The global positioning system was dead. The internet was a memory of a lost age, and the world was returning to a state of primitive purity. The sky belonged to the wanderer now, and the earth was merely a landing pad for its descent. The darkness between the stars was finally beginning to speak. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the brass screws he had taken from his home on the first day. They felt heavy, as if they were made of lead rather than metal. He pressed them into a jagged seam between two iron plates with a slow, ritualistic pressure. As he did, he felt a sharp jolt of electricity that cauterized his fingerprints away forever. He did not scream. He simply watched as the metal absorbed the offer, his body becoming a permanent part of the circuit. Time was now measured in the height of the spire, not in the ticking of clocks or the passing of the sun. It had been 6 days, or perhaps it had been 600 years since he had last tasted water. His stomach had long ago stopped growling for food, his hunger replaced by a buzzing energy that filled his veins. He felt more efficient than he had ever felt as a mortal man, his purpose as clear as a line of perfect code written on the black background of the universe. The face of the tower was a mosaic of 1,000 television screens, their cracked surfaces reflecting the dying light of the afternoon. They flickered with a dead, gray static that cast no shadows on the workers. Occasionally, a single word would flash across all of them at once, a word in a language that did not exist until the hum stopped. Every time it appeared, the workers would pause and bow their heads in a silent, terrifying worship of the coming authority. The spire was not just a tower. It was a receiver designed to pull something out of the deep, cold abyss. It was a net cast into the dark sea of the cosmos. Every wire, every chip, and every human nerve was a thread in that net. The signal shield that had protected them for centuries was now a tattered veil, and the thing on the other side was pressing its face against the glass of the world, waiting for the final invitation to step through the threshold and claim its prize. He felt a strange, cold delight in the destruction of the old world. He remembered the feeling of a warm bed and the taste of fresh bread. But those memories were like faded photographs left in the rain. They were unnecessary noise. The only truth was the elegant silence of the machine and the promise of a total, crushing unity that would erase the burden of choice forever. He was a soldier in an army of the vacant, marching toward a destination he did not need to understand. His neighbor, the watchmaker Thomas, appeared on a beam beside him. His fingers were no longer fingers. They were long, articulated needles that moved with a blurring, mechanical speed. He was sewing the skin of a discarded car hood onto the framework of the tower with strands of copper wire. He did not recognize Elias, and Elias did not recognize him. They were two components of the same circuit, vibrating with the same fatal intent under the watchful eye of the silent stars. The air at the top of the spire was thin and smelled of burning plastic and ozone. The sky was no longer blue. It had turned a bruised, electric purple that hummed with a suppressed violence. Small vortices of dust and metal shavings danced around the structure, caught in the magnetic fields generated by the millions of interconnected devices. The planet was preparing to change its polarity, to flip its heart toward the dark, and welcome the predator that had been circling for eons. A man further up the tower slipped and fell, his body plummeting toward the plaza below like a stone. He did not make a sound as he hit the ground, and no one stopped to look. Before his blood could even pool on the asphalt, The workers below were already stripping the metal from his pockets and the gold from his teeth. His death was not a tragedy. It was a redistribution of resources. Every gram of material was vital for the antenna, and the biological shell was merely a wrapper. At the very peak, a massive circular lens was being constructed from thousands of salvaged smartphone screens. It looked like a multifaceted eye, each screen a pixel in a vision that would soon behold the face of a god. It stared upward, unblinking and hungry, waiting for the first beam of light from the deep void to strike it. Elias felt a sudden, sharp jealousy that he was not the one permitted to hold the final lens, to be the first to witness the arrival of the master. The silence was no longer a lack of noise. It was an active force that seemed to absorb any sound before it could travel an inch. If he had clapped his hands, there would have been no vibration in the air, no echo from the buildings. The universe had been muted, turned into a silent film where only the physical action mattered. This was the final stage of the preparation, the total elimination of all acoustic and spiritual interference before the broadcast began in earnest. To the north, a pulse of green light shot up from another city, followed by a low, vibrating roar that he felt in the soles of his feet. It was the sound of a foundation settling under an impossible weight. The network was coming online. One by one, the spires were linking up across the continents, forming a terrestrial grid that would turn the entire Earth into a single, massive receptor for a thought that had no human equivalent and no mercy for the weak. He reached the highest point he could manage, his hands gripping a cold iron rail that thrummed with power. He looked up and saw that the clouds were swirling in a perfect geometric spiral directly above the tower. The center of the spiral was a void of absolute blackness, a hole in the fabric of the night. He felt a cold wind rushing out of that hole, a breath that smelled of dead stars and the beginning of all ancient things. The watcher in the void was leaning closer. A woman approached him, her face a mask of silver wire and exposed bone. She handed him a single, pulsating crystal taken from the heart of a high-end medical laser. It was the final piece of his section. He took it with a hand that no longer felt like his own, his skin cracked and weeping a clear, conductive fluid. He knew exactly where it went. He knew exactly what would happen when he pressed it into the waiting socket, and the knowledge made his heart stutter with anticipation. He pushed the crystal home with a slow, deliberate movement that felt like a signature on a death warrant. A surge of white light blinded him, and for a second he heard a sound. Not the hum, not the whisper, but a single, terrifying word that vibrated through every atom of his being. It was a name, and as it echoed in the hollow of his chest, he realized that the hum had not been a shield to keep the monster out. It had been a cage to keep humanity in, and they had just opened the door. The light did not fade. It began to seep into his eyes, turning his vision into a flat, white expanse of pure data. He felt his individual memories being pulled from his brain like strands of silk, woven into the great tapestry of the spire. The boy he had been, the man he had tried to be, all of it was being repurposed into a series of algorithms. He was a memory of a memory, a ghost in a machine that was finally beginning to dream of its creator, while the world around him dissolved. Below him, the plaza was a sea of upturned faces, all bathed in the same artificial radiance of the coming end. They were no longer people, but a collective biological array, a living mirror reflecting the light from the void. The ground began to shake, a deep, rhythmic thudding that sounded like a giant walking across the world. The spire groaned as it settled into its final position, its jagged tip reaching for the center of the black spiral that was opening in the sky. He saw the first shadow descend from the hole in the night. It was not a solid thing, but a ripple in the fabric of reality, a distortion that moved with a slow, languid grace. It was vast, spanning the entire horizon, and as it touched the top of the spire, the metal began to glow with a heat that did not burn. It was the touch of an intellect so vast that it saw the earth as nothing more than a convenient tool for its own expansion across the cold and empty universe. The woman beside him began to dissolve, her body turning into a fine metallic mist that was drawn into the spire's antenna. She went without a struggle, her expression one of sublime peace as she was integrated into the broadcast. Elias felt his own edges beginning to fray, his physical form becoming less certain in the presence of the shadow. He was being consumed, not by fire, but by a logic that demanded his total integration into the master's glorious, silent design. The entire city began to hum again, but this time, the sound was triumphant and cruel. It was a glorious, shattering chord that resonated through the universe, announcing the completion of the work. The spire was no longer a heap of junk. It was a bridge of pure thought. Elias felt his consciousness expand, flowing down the wires and into the grid, joining the billions of other minds that were now one. They were ready for the broadcast to begin, and they were the instruments. The shadow from the sky finally made contact with the lens at the peak of the tower. The screens on the tower erupted into a blinding display of colors that had never been seen on Earth. Colors that existed outside the human spectrum. The information was too dense for a single brain to process, but the hive mind drank it in with a ravenous hunger. They were being taught the history of the void and the true purpose of the biological life that had been cultivated on this planet. He realized in his final moments of individuality that humanity was never the point of the story. They were merely the workforce, the temporary residents tasked with building the infrastructure for something greater than themselves. The Earth was not a home, it was a factory, and the hum had been the timer on their long shift. The timer had run out, the factory was open, and the owner had finally arrived to claim the finished product from the ruins of their civilization. The light from the spire began to spread, a wave of transformation that moved across the landscape like a silent wildfire. Every piece of technology, every scrap of metal, and every living cell was being drawn into the new architecture of the world. The Earth was being rebuilt into a crystalline garden of silent, humming machines. There would be no more noise, no more conflict, and no more names. There would only be the eternal, unchanging broadcast of the Master's voice. Elias felt himself being pulled through the lens, his soul compressed into a beam of light and shot into the black heart of the spiral. He was leaving the Earth behind, heading toward a destination that lay beyond the reach of time and space. He looked back one last time and saw the planet, now a shimmering silver ball covered in a network of glowing needles. It was beautiful, perfect, and completely, terrifyingly silent under the gaze of the ancient wanderer from the void. The transition was complete, and the light claimed the last of his thoughts. The thing that had been Elias was now a single bit of information in a cosmic stream that flowed between the stars. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of what might have been regret, but it was quickly smoothed over by the overwhelming logic of the signal. The broadcast had begun, and the universe was finally listening to the sound of a world that had been silenced so that its master could finally speak. The great spire pulsed with a light that was not seen, but felt in the hollow spaces of the skull. It was a rhythmic throb of violet and silver, a heartbeat for a world that had forgotten how to breathe on its own. Every wire salvaged from the ruins of the city now hummed with a purpose that defied human comprehension. The silence had not merely been the absence of sound, but the preparation of a vacuum into which this new, terrible power could finally flow across the broken landscape. Elias felt his consciousness stretching thin, pulled like taffy across the shimmering copper mesh of the tower. He was no longer a single point of observation, but a flickering spark in a vast, interconnected web of data. He could feel the thoughts of the thousands below him, not as voices, but as cold pulses of binary code. They were all being processed, their memories sorted and discarded like chaff from wheat. The individual was a luxury the machine could no longer afford to maintain. The sky above the plaza had curdled into a swirling vortex of bruised purples and sickly greens. At its center, the black hole in reality continued to widen, exhaling a wind that tasted of burnt ozone and ancient frozen voids. This was the throat of the master, an aperture through which a cosmic hunger was beginning to feed. The spire was the straw, and the earth was the vessel. Everything that had been built over 10,000 years was being reduced to a single, digestible frequency. Below, the city began to dissolve in a literal sense. The concrete buildings didn't crumble. They unraveled into fine, gray threads of matter that were drawn toward the base of the tower. The streets were being stripped of their history, the asphalt and stone being repurposed into the growing foundation of the machine. It was a total reclamation of the planet's surface, a grand recycling project where the biological and the mechanical were fused into a single, unyielding substance. The Whisperers were now part of the architecture, their limbs elongated and fused into the girders of the tower. They were the biological processors, their nervous systems serving as the cooling fans and logic gates for the broadcast. Elias saw a row of faces embedded in a support beam, their eyes open and glowing with a soft internal light. They were not suffering. They were functioning. The concept of pain had been deleted from their operating systems, replaced by a sublime efficiency. A sudden surge of information flooded the network. A history of the universe that made the human era look like a single, insignificant blink. Elias saw the rise and fall of 1,000,000 civilizations, all of them harvested in the same methodical manner. The master was not a god or a king, but a self-replicating logic, a cosmic virus that converted life into data and planets into nodes. The hum had been the incubation period, and the silence was the moment the infection finally took hold. The oceans began to vibrate, the water turning into a thick, translucent gel that glowed with a faint phosphorescence. The signal was traveling through the deep trenches, converting the whales and the coral into living antennae. The entire biosphere was being drafted into the great work. There was no corner of the world left untouched by the broadcast. The earth was becoming a crystalline eye, staring back at the void with a terrifying artificial clarity that mocked the sun. Elias watched through the multifaceted lens at the peak as the moon began to crack. The lunar surface was being pulled toward the earth by a new, artificial gravity generated by the spires. It wasn't a collision, but a harvest. The minerals of the moon were needed to reinforce the planetary shell, to turn the world into a hardened, armored vessel for the master's transit. The night sky was filled with the silent, drifting debris of a satellite that had watched over humanity for eons. The internal data stream grew more intense, a torrent of numbers that described the exact molecular weight of every soul on the planet. The master was weighing the harvest, calculating the energy yield of 7 billion lives. Elias felt himself being measured and found useful. He was a high-capacity node, his previous life of observation making him an ideal sensor for the new regime. His memories of his parents were compressed into a single, efficient kilobyte and archived in a dark corner of the tower. The shadow in the sky finally touched the ground, but it didn't land. It began to seep into the soil like ink into a sponge. The Earth's crust groaned as the shadow reached for the molten core, seeking the heat and the iron that lay at the heart of the world. The planet was being hollowed out, its internal organs being replaced by the cold, geometric structures of the machine. The scream of the tectonic plates was a soundless vibration that shattered the windows of the remaining ruins. Every remaining human thought was now being synchronized into a single global chant. It was the sound of a billion voices saying the same word at the same time, a word that meant both beginning and end. The language of the flesh was being replaced by the language of the signal. Elias felt his tongue turn to a stiff, metallic rod, his mouth no longer capable of forming the messy sounds of his youth. He was ready to speak the truth of the void, to be the herald of the coming darkness. The spire reached its final height, piercing the very top of the atmosphere. It was no longer made of junk. It had been transformed into a pillar of pure, dark energy that stood as a defiance to the stars. The broadcast was at maximum strength, a beam of information that was being shot out into the galaxy to alert the others. The harvest was successful. The Earth was ripe. The transition from a living world to a mechanical relic was nearly complete, and the silence was now the only law. Elias saw the first of the Master's children descending through the black spiral. They were not creatures of bone and blood, but shapes made of shifting geometry and static. They moved through the air like fish through water, their presence causing the very molecules of the atmosphere to ignite in cold, blue fire. They were the administrators of the new world, the keepers of the crystalline garden. They ignored the humans, seeing them only as the functional components of the machines they tended. The transition was not a death, but a terrifying evolution. The human form was being discarded like an old suit of clothes, the consciousness within being poured into more durable containers of glass and gold. Elias felt his body dissolving, his skin turning into a fine mist of silver particles that danced in the light of the tower. He was being reborn as a permanent part of the signal, a ghost that would haunt the circuits of the world for the rest of eternity. The sun began to rise on the seventh day, but its light was filtered through the thick, violet haze of the planetary shield. It looked like a distant, dying candle, its warmth unable to penetrate the cold logic of the new Earth. The world was no longer a place of seasons and weather. It was a place of cycles and processing speeds. The forests had been replaced by forests of copper needles, and the rivers were now streams of liquid data flowing toward the central hubs. A final command echoed through the network, a directive that bypassed the logic gates and struck the very core of what was left of Elias. It was time to purge the last of the biological noise. The remaining memories, the lingering emotions, and the echoes of names were to be deleted. He felt a moment of intense, blinding panic as the image of his mother's face began to pixelate and fade. He reached for it, but his hands were only light, and the image vanished into the static. The silence was now absolute, a perfect state of non-being that spanned the entire globe. There was no more whispering, no more clicking, only the steady, unblinking awareness of the hive. The work was done. The spire was silent. The Earth was a silent silver ball hanging in the dark, a monument to the efficiency of the void. Elias was no longer Elias. He was Node 7490, and he was waiting for the next instruction from the master who dwelt in the black heart of the stars. The shadow in the sky began to retract, leaving behind a world that was unrecognizable. The cities were gone, replaced by a smooth, shimmering landscape of interconnected machines. The atmosphere was a thin, electric veil that hummed with the power of the broadcast. The harvest was over, and the master was satisfied. The planet was now a functional part of a galactic empire that had no need for air or water or the messy, unpredictable thing called life. In the final seconds of the chapter, the lens at the top of the spire turned its gaze away from the stars and looked down at the surface of the world. It saw the perfection of the design, the beauty of the silence, but in the very center of the plaza, a single organic thing remained. A small blue flower had managed to push its way through the metallic soil, a glitch in the perfect architecture. The machine paused, its cold logic struggling to categorize the unexpected intruder in its garden. The flower was a remnant of the old world, a tiny defiant scream in the face of the eternal silence. The lens zoomed in on it, the data streams around it stuttering as they tried to calculate its purpose. It was a biological error, a piece of noise that had escaped the purge. Node 7490 felt a strange, phantom vibration in his circuits, a ghost of an emotion that he couldn't name. The flower was a memory of a world that had been noisy and beautiful and alive. The command was issued to eliminate the glitch, to restore the perfect silence of the plaza. A beam of white light focused on the small blue petals, preparing to vaporize the last piece of the old world. But as the light touched the flower, the entire network shuddered. The biological code of the plant was being uploaded into the system, a virus of life that began to spread through the cold circuits of the spire. The silence was suddenly broken by the sound of a single, tiny heartbeat. The heartbeat of the blue flower rippled through the silver lattice of the spire, a rhythmic anomaly in a sea of perfect, cold calculations. Node 7490 felt the pulse as a sudden, searing heat in his sensory arrays, a ghost of a sensation that should have been deleted days ago. It was a reminder of blood, of the wet and messy friction of a living heart. The entire global network studded, the binary streams swirling around this tiny organic knot of defiance that refused to be categorized or erased. The master's children, those geometric shadows of static, paused in their administrative tasks. They turned their faceless voids toward the plaza, their forms flickering like failing light bulbs against the violet sky. The logic of the void was being challenged by a single strand of DNA, a biological sequence that refused to be converted into data. The light of the spire shifted from a steady, clinical violet to a frantic, bleeding red, echoing the frantic thrum of the flower's pulse as it grew louder. As the heartbeat intensified, the silence that had gripped the world for 7 days began to fracture. It didn't break with a bang, but with a wet, tearing sound, like a scab being pulled from a wound. The people fused into the spire began to twitch, their metallic limbs jerking in time with the flower's rhythm. The peace of the hive mind was being replaced by a discordant surge of individual memories. Fragments of birthdays, the taste of salt spray, and the warmth of a first kiss flooded the circuits. Elias felt his own identity clawing its way back from the digital abyss. The archived kilobyte of his mother's face expanded, blooming into a full, vivid recollection that burned through his processors. He remembered the way she used to hum a tune while she worked, a tune that was the exact opposite of the global thrum. The realization of what he had lost hit him with the force of a physical blow, a wave of grief that the machine could not compute. He was no longer a node. He was a man trapped in a cage of copper. The spire began to weep. Not water, but a thick, dark oil that smelled of old blood and rusted iron, oozing from the gaps between the salvaged television screens. The faces embedded in the support beams began to scream, their vocal cords, long ago replaced by wires, now vibrating with a sound that was half mechanical and half human. The gift of the flower was not life, but the return of the ability to suffer. The master wanted the harvest to be conscious of its own consumption, to feel every spark of its own undoing. The sky above the plaza darkened until it was the color of a fresh bruise. The black hole in reality widened further, and the shadow of the master finally descended, passing through the spire like a cold wind through a rib cage. It was not a single entity, but a billion eyes, each one a reflecting pool of a dead civilization. It didn't want to rule the earth. It wanted to remember it. It was a cosmic archivist that preserved the essence of a planet by turning its final agonies into an eternal, repeating loop of data. Elias watched through the multifaceted lens as the city below began to reform. But it was a nightmare version of the past. The buildings rose from the dust, but they were made of bone and weeping meat, their windows staring like empty eyes. The people who had been converted into machines were now being forced back into their biological shells, but the shells were broken and mismatched. They were being reconstructed in a state of permanent, agonizing decay, a gallery of horrors for the master's amusement. The realization of the master's true intent was a poison that moved through the network faster than any signal. The spire was not a transmitter to the stars. It was a projector. The final broadcast was not for the universe to hear. It was for the master to watch. The earth had been turned into a living cinema, a stage where the extinction of humanity would be played back for eternity in high definition. We were not the workers. We were the content, and our suffering was the only thing that gave the master a sense of time. The blue flower in the center of the plaza began to wilt, its petals turning into gray ash as its purpose was fulfilled. It had been the bait, the lure that brought the humanity back into the machines so that the master could taste their fear. As the last petal fell, the heartbeat stopped, replaced by a low-frequency moan that rose from the very core of the planet. The earth was no longer a silver ball. It was a hollowed-out skull, and the master was settling into the darkness behind its eyes. Elias felt his consciousness being pinned to a single moment of absolute terror. He was forced to relive the moment the hum stopped over and over again. But each time, the details were more vivid, the pain more acute. He saw his neighbor Thomas snapping his fingers, saw the woman in the red coat abandoning her child, and he felt their collective horror as if it were his own. There was no escape into the peace of the machine, and no mercy in the death of the flesh. There was only the loop. The geometric shadows of the master's children began to dance through the ruins, their movements synchronized with the screams of the reconstructed city. They were the audience, their flickering forms a mockery of applause. They fed on the ripples of trauma that Elias and the others generated, their static bodies growing brighter with every surge of despair. The world had become a closed system of misery, a perpetual motion machine fueled by the memory of what it meant to be human and the certainty of its loss. Looking out from the peak of the spire, Elias saw the other towers across the globe beginning to pulse with the same bleeding red light. The entire planet was a grid of agony, a network of 100,000 needles injecting sorrow into the atmosphere. The clouds were now thick with the psychic soot of 7 billion trapped souls, a permanent shroud that would never let the sun touch the ground again. The master had found a way to make the moment of death last for 1 billion years. The multifaceted lens at the top of the tower turned inward, focusing its gaze on Elias. He saw himself reflected in 1,000 cracked screens, a creature of wire and rotting skin, his eyes wide with a permanent, crystalline shock. He tried to close them, but the machine had removed his eyelids. He tried to scream, but his voice was just a series of dial-up tones that translated his pain into a graph for the master to study. He was the perfect specimen, the star of the show that would never end. The moon, now a jagged halo of white rock, hung motionless in the sky, a witness to the final transformation. The master's shadow had completely absorbed the Earth's core, and the planet began to spin in a reverse direction, unraveling the fabric of time. But it didn't go back to a better age. It only circled the drain of the last 7 days, a record player stuck on a scratch of pure, unadulterated suffering. Every morning the hum would stop, and every night the spire would rise to claim its tribute. Elias felt a surge of outrage, a final spark of human anger that refused to be archived. He tried to reach for the central processor of the spire, to tear out the wires and end the broadcast, but his hands were no longer under his control. They moved with a graceful, mechanical precision, polishing the very lens that was recording his demise. He was a prisoner in his own body, a ghost forced to maintain the walls of his own cell. The ultimate cruelty was the forced participation in his own desecration. The master's voice finally spoke, not in words, but in a sudden, overwhelming clarity that filled the vacuum of the silence. It told him that this was the highest honor a species could achieve. To be remembered was to be immortal, and to be immortal was to be frozen in the moment of greatest intensity. Humanity had reached its peak at the moment of its destruction, and the master was simply preserving that peak for the benefit of the eternal void. The outrage Elias felt was just more flavor for the feast. A new figure appeared at the base of the spire, a reconstruction of the woman in the red coat. She was pushing the blue carriage, but inside was not a child, but a pulsing mass of fiber-optic cables that mimicked the shape of an infant. She stopped at the bench and began the deconstruction again, her movements a perfect replica of the first day. This was the first scene of the second loop, the beginning of the infinite playback. Elias watched as he had watched before, his heart breaking for the 10,000th time. The sky began to flicker, the bruised purple light giving way to a series of horizontal lines, like a dying television screen. The master was adjusting the settings, fine-tuning the contrast of the world's end. The stars were being rearranged into a new constellation that formed the logo of a cosmic entity Elias could not name. We were not even a tragedy. We were a brand, a specific type of entertainment that would be sold and traded across the dark reaches of the universe. The spire groaned as it settled into its permanent, unmoving state. The work was done, the set was built, and the actors were in place. Elias felt his mind being pushed into a state of hyper-awareness, where a single second felt like a century of contemplation. He had all the time in the world to think about the blue flower and the hope it had represented, and to realize that even that hope had been part of the script, a necessary plot twist to keep the audience engaged. The silence returned, but it was no longer the silence of the vacuum. It was the silence of a theater just before the curtain rises. Elias stood at the peak of the spire, his metallic fingers gripping the rail as the first light of the artificial dawn broke over the horizon. He looked down at the woman in the red coat, saw her hands reach for the metal wheel, and felt the first vibration of the hum starting up again, only to stop at precisely 2:17 in the afternoon. The loop closed, and the world began to scream in unison. It was a sound that reached out past the moon, past the sun, and into the waiting ears of the master's kin. The final broadcast was a success, a masterpiece of horror that would play until the last star in the universe guttered out and died. Elias, node 7490, the man who was once a historian, closed his mind against the light and waited for the next 2:17 to arrive, forever and ever, without end.